Today I want to talk about three separate subjects for Starfield: seamless planetary landings, 30 FPS on consoles, as well as PC system requirements. We'll jump right in and start this off with seamless planetary landings. Now, I'm pretty sure that most people will be aware of what this is, but just for context, just in case, this is the ability to seamlessly travel from space all the way down to the planetary surface without any landing screen, and that's heading directly through the atmosphere if the planet has one. Now the question is, how much does this actually matter? Well, based on the comments I've seen around the internet, on my YouTube videos and elsewhere, it seems that for the most part, most people don't seem too bothered by this. But there is a pretty vocal group, and perhaps a rather, relatively significantly sized group who are bothered by this. Now, I'm going to generalize a bit here, but as a very generalized statement, I suspect for the most part the people who do care about this come from more traditional space sims such as Elite Dangerous or Star Citizen, whereas the people who are not too bothered generally probably tend to be RPG players who play games like Skyrim and Fallout. Either way, we can break the subject of the lack of seamless planetary landings down into two subjects. Firstly, does it actually matter? Secondly, why did Bethesda go this route? So we start with, does it actually matter? Well, this one is very subjective. It will ultimately depend on how people feel about it, so very hard to say, does it actually matter? Subjectively, yes of course, depending on which camp you fit in. Objectively, maybe not, depending on what you feel this type of open world RPG should be. But let's get down to the nitty gritty nonetheless. Again, some generalized ideas here. So for those type of players who really do love immersion, who love to see games as an alternative life sim as it were, well, the idea then of seamlessly transitioning between space and interiors and just about everything else really does add to immersion. So without that ability, it's really kind of taken away from the overall experience. So yeah, that's if you like games for realism and immersion. On the other hand, a lot of people like games for gameplay and sometimes feel realism get in the way. Elite Dangerous is a classic example here, Star Citizen to an extent as well. The travel times can really hinder gameplay. And if we're going to go the realistic route, then travelling down from space down to a planetary surface is going to take time. The question then becomes, does this really add anything of value into a single-player RPG? Personally, up front, I'm not too bothered about it. Although that said, I do absolutely love that type of flight. So yeah, the bottom line here, from my point of view at least, is that whilst I do love this type of seamless planetary landings in a space game, I don't think it would add anything of value into Starfield. Either way, do let me know what your thoughts and feelings are in the comments section below. Which camp, if any, do you sit in? Next up is the subject of why didn't Bethesda include this in the game? Now, of course, we have to speculate on this, and there's a lot of room for speculation, but I feel it's relatively easy to, kind of assume what the most likely reasons are. And it seems that it probably comes, down to two things. The overall gameplay decision, which kind of touches on the subject we've just mentioned, with travel times and other aspects just getting in the way of overall gameplay, but also developmental and resource cost time. And here we could probably use a Star Citizen as a fantastic example. In terms of Star Citizen, it's come at a technological cost in terms of development as well as resources. The game has been over 10 years in development at this point and is still nowhere near completion. And even still, to this day, they don't have a fully working game. Yes, the game is alpha, it's still in, some people would argue, early development even after 10 years, but I really do feel that in some cases you can pursue scope and scale and ultimately end up forgetting gameplay. Bethesda, on the other hand, are very much known for gameplay, as well as creating a living, breathing world. If the cost of that is creating space and planets as distinctly separate entities, then so be it. I think we can kind of continue this discussion on performance and technological capabilities in the segment on 30 FPS and console performance, so let's get to that. Starfield is going to be locked at 30 frames per second on both Xboxes, 4K 30 FPS on the Xbox Series X, and 1440p 30 FPS on the Series S. Now, when it really comes down to it, I don't think people should be too surprised at this. Bethesda staff pretty much have hinted at this over the past year or so that it was going to be the case. and Todd Howard very specifically come close to saying this on the Lex Friedman podcast, that he prefers fidelity over frame rate. This though is somewhat of a contentious subject. After all, if you spend any amount of time playing games at 60 frames per second, they feel very smooth, and going back to 30 frames per second can feel very, very jarring. It's also a little hard to understand why some games that are visually great can have 60 frames per second, whilst other games that are not quite so visually good are stuck at 30 frames per second. Fortunately for us, very recently, a Digital Foundry have taken a deep dive into this very subject in an attempt to answer it. Now, the video they've made is 45 minutes long, so it's a pretty long one, as usual for the case with them, but well worth a watch. But I'll summarise some of the key points here. The main point seems to be down to the level and the extent to which Bethesda are simulating everything in Starfield. For example, there's the sandwiches we saw in the video clip. Each sandwich here has physics attached to it, and it's also tracked in the world. Each location of each of them is individually stored and recorded. Now the same is applied to absolutely every single item in the game that you interact with. All of these do have to be simulated, recorded and remembered. Further, extend this to NPCs. Now there's always the old story with Skyrim. Many of you will remember that if you encounter an NPC at a village, maybe working in a field or in a shop or something like that, at a later date you may encounter them walking down the road. And the reason for this is pretty simple, although fairly complex in execution I would imagine. And that is, all the NPCs are simulated regardless of your presence. So even if you're over on the other side of the map, those NPCs back in the shop in that little village are still being tracked and simulated. Albeit far down the processing queue, the priority queue, they don't get fully simulated with every single aspect, but they are being tracked nonetheless. Now, if you take all of these items and all of these NPCs, throw into the mix a load of spaceships, bases and other things, all of which are likely being tracked and simulated, well, there's a whole lot going on for any computer or any console. And this is the reason, very, very likely the reason, whilst we're getting 30 frames per second on consoles when it comes to Starfield. I think in today's technology that is completely understandable. It's not ideal, but it is understandable. If the counteroffer to that was 60 frames per second, but a galaxy that wasn't as detailed and wasn't as simulated, well, it wouldn't really be a Bethesda title, would it? Keep in mind that I'm not for 1 second saying here that anyone who wants 60 frames per second is completely in the wrong. Of course you're not. It's completely understandable to want 60 frames per second, but it seems in reality that that's just not going to be possible, at least not for consoles. When it comes to PC, on the other hand, the story may be slightly different. I don't think there's any full-on official confirmation here, not anything that Bethesda are willing to commit to at any rate, but it seems possible that 60 frames per second on PC may be a thing. But whether or not it will go above that, maybe 60 frames per second will be the cap. Either way, we'll have to see. At any rate, some of this is going to come down to system requirements, and these are pretty beefy. Let's look over on the Steam page where you can see exactly what the system requirements are on PC. So for minimum system requirements, we've got an AMD Ryzen 5 2600X and a 6th generation Intel, the i7 6800K. Now, at this point, these are pretty old processors, but these are still pretty good processors. I've been using the i7 6800K up until very recently, actually, on an older PC. 16 gigabytes of RAM is going to be the minimum. That may be a surprise and a little bit of a problem for some people. And the minimum graphics card is a GeForce 1070 Ti. That's still a fairly decent card at this point in time. And at the last point here, the last 2 points, 125 gigabyte storage space. That is pretty beefy indeed. And an SSD is required. So you absolutely will not be able to use a traditional hard drive when it comes to Starfield. I think many people at this point probably do have an SSD, but quite possibly not everyone. At least not everyone will have an SSD with 125 gigabytes of storage space completely free. So those are the minimum system requirements for PC, and that may speak a little bit as to why we're seeing 30 FPS on consoles. When it comes to recommended, we're looking at quite a beefy graphics card here, a GeForce RTX 2080. 2 generations old at this point, but that is still a very, very powerful card. And in terms of processors, we're looking at a Ryzen 5 3600X and a 10th generation Intel, that's the i5 10600K. Again, that SSD requirement. So there we have it, some pretty beefy recommended system requirements. What this ultimately means for any PC that wants to run 4K and Ultra or Max settings, well, time will tell on that front. Anyway, that's where we are with Starfield on those particular issues. Do let me know your thoughts and feelings on all of these subjects in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you. As always, thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys and girls next time.